This week, U.S. boxing under fire for its new transgender policy. A public school coach in Vermont loses his job and loses in court over common sense comments. And the Missouri Attorney General scores a win against a St. Louis area school, keeping bathroom policy a secret from parents. These stories and much more coming up on The Lion Week in Review. Welcome into this week's edition of The Lion Week in Review. It's a weekly look at the culture, the courts, your state capitol, and your kids. I'm Chris Stigall. Now, let's meet our panel. Some of the men and women behind the stories at ReadLion.com. Michael Ryan is the executive editor at The Lion, and Josh Mann, the managing editor. Gentlemen, welcome to both.
Thank you.
I'm so glad to have you. The stories continue to percolate at The Lion on the issue of transgenderism and competitive sports. It just seems to be a never-ending cycle of stories. We were talking about it before the taping began here. This seems to be sort of the preeminent discussion of our time, and it seemed to kind of fall out of the sky, Michael, in the last, 3-4 years max. I don't feel like we were even talking about this at this volume a few years ago.
Yeah, and I think it's something everybody understands. I mean, we can all understand, as much as some people want to say that they have to be a biologist to understand these things. I think people can understand, gender.
Yeah, it seems like it's a pretty easy thing to get. But Josh, do you have any sense in all your reporting what drives it?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on. I think one is we have become a culture that's very introspective, and it's all about, well, how do I feel and how do I express myself in this very kind of me-centered culture, and I think that's part of it. And then I think there's this acceptance of doubting any overarching truth, or so to say that, well, you can only be one gender or sex, which seems obvious, and biologically it is. I think when somebody questions that, you're really not to question them because it's quote unquote their truth and how they feel.
Yeah, and the other thing is it applies to everybody. I mean, nobody's left out of this discussion. If we were talking about tax policy, we might be talking to our accountants or something. But this involves every living human being. Moreover, it's applied differently in different circumstances by different people at different levels of government. So, and in corporations too. So, I mean, there's just, you throw this out there and it becomes a million different things overnight.
Which brings us to one of the stories you've authored there at The Lion, Josh, this coach. I mean, you're now finding, a lot of times this is a story about women and how women feel about it, biological men competing against women or female coaches who've spoken out. I've often asked rhetorically, where are the men in this discussion? I think a lot of high school coaches in particular who are men feel like, I don't want to weigh in on this because it could mean trouble for me. You've written a story to just that point.
That's right. This David Block, a Vermont snowboarding coach, did just that. This was a conversation he was having, and he just chimed in while two of his athletes, snowboarding athletes, were discussing whether or not men have a biological advantage, because there was a transgender athlete competing, apparently a biological male, competing against females in the sport. And he chimed in with his opinion that men have a biological advantage, which actually I think seems to be fairly factual. However, he was reprimanded by the district and told by the governing association that he had violated policy. The man has since sued and had a simple request. When he sued, the judge said it will go to trial essentially a whole year later. So he was just asking the court for a temporary injunction. Basically, can you help me out a little bit, so I don't have to sit here on my hands for a year? And the judge just said no. And so that was the latest reporting that we did.
This is a speech issue, Michael, isn't it? I mean, this story is just about speech. It's not even a debate about science.
Well, it's about many things.
Yeah.
Like all of these stories about gender, it's about much more than gender. It's about due process, for one thing. I mean, the gentleman was fired summarily and did not apparently have a chance to defend himself before getting fired. It's about free speech, as you say. It's about your right, your ability to speak your mind about certain things of public interest without fear. And frankly, it's probably about viewpoint discrimination as well in this case, in that I don't suppose he would have been fired if his opinion had been more in line with the current dogma.
And is that where we are? Is that sort of the new socially accepted premise that public school teachers are now no longer able to speak openly about biology?
I think that's certainly how they feel, and intentionally so. I think those who believe these things want them to feel that way. And in Vermont, this same governing body, we've reported on at least two other times taking action against other schools or persons, including a Christian school who did not want their girls' basketball team to compete against another school because that school had a biological male on the basketball team. So they're called the Vermont Principals Association, but this is the sporting governing body. They kicked out the Christian school. And then in another story, we saw a group of volleyball players who objected to the presence of a male in their locker room, a biological male who was transgender, and they actually got kicked out of their own locker room.
Wow. This is, and incidentally, this is not exclusive to public schools. To be clear, we have, I think, even done previous episodes talking about Catholic schools and other faith-based Christian schools this is infiltrating there too, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, this issue is getting everywhere. It's seeping everywhere. And to the point of teachers fearing for their jobs, they need to be fearing for their jobs at this point for speaking their mind. I don't think even Orwell could have predicted this sort of thought crime. In this particular case, this gentleman was fired for violating the district policy against harassment, hazing, and bullying. Now, do you think what he said in that kind of informal setting, which apparently was made respectfully, is any of those things? It just seems kind of odd to me. And the other thing is that strikes me as odd is the fact that he didn't prevail in this request for an injunction. You know, I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on podcasts. And I can tell you that normally the rule of thumb is if he's likely to prevail in the end, he gets that injunction. Well, I don't know. It seems to me he's likely to prevail.
This makes me kind of think of the Coach Joe Kennedy story in that, not that they're related subject matter-wise, but it is related speech-wise, isn't it? In Coach Joe Kennedy's case, he wanted to pray. His school district ultimately ends up running him out of the job for praying on the sidelines during football games. Famously, the Supreme Court gets involved and reinstates him. How is this really fundamentally different, do you think, Josh?
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think it is fundamentally different. I think it's about First Amendment rights. It's about freedom of speech and really freedom of opinion. And on a previous episode, Michael, you said something that I thought was profound but chilling, and that was that the only thing worse than your freedom of speech being taken away is compelled speech.
Yeah.
And I think teachers are under pressure to not only not speak, but when they do, to say certain things.
And in the case of the football coach who was fired for praying, he was praying silently. It was in his head. It was just that he was striking a pray pose.
Yes.
What they used to call T-bowing. Remember that?
Yes, that's right.
I suppose in this case of the snowboarding coach, he could have gotten in trouble for striking the wrong pose and thinking the wrong thing.
Meanwhile, in the state of Missouri, the Attorney General there has been locking horns with a particular school district on their transgender policies. This seems to be a running theme as well. A lot of public school districts that are trying to kind of do this undercover rather than be completely transparent about what their policies are.
That's right. So this is the Wentzville School District near St. Louis. And what happened here was interesting because the board apparently has a transgender bathroom policy, but didn't want to speak about it in an open session. We only know some of these facts because two of the board members became whistleblowers and signed affidavits that had to do with the lawsuit that the AG, Andrew Bailey, brought. And apparently one of the other members was worried about litigation. They thought if we start talking about this in open session, this could lead to lawsuits. And in fact, someone in that meeting said it's none of the parents' business to know, which of course the AG and a lot of parents, not only there, but I would say around the state, disagree.
Yeah.
And the only reason we know that that was said in that private meeting is because one of their colleagues on the board became a whistleblower. Now think about that. Elected officials as whistleblowers for their own government's policies. That's a weird area we're getting into. And the main thing here, though, is, to me, it's an open meetings violation not to have had this debate, this discussion, this decision in a public meeting.
I really am struck. I know this is not new ground we're plowing here, but I continue to be struck by school officials, public school officials, who continually take the stance that when it comes to gender specifically and students, that's something we can keep secret between the public schools, the teachers, the administrators. Keep that from the home. Keep that from the family, the parents. That seems to be a running, growing, disturbing theme, in my opinion.
Yeah, you're right. And I think, if in the best case scenario, it's coming from the LGBT lobby who are trying to err on the side of those they represent. And so we'll hear about a scenario where maybe a child would face an abusive environment in their own home. But when we start to talk about hypothetical scenarios, or maybe we actually need to put stats on that. We need to know, well, how many of these kids actually face an abusive home life? And in any way, does it give the government or the school the right to actually hide things from parents? Because I think a vast majority of the parents are not abusive and have every right to know about the health and wellness of their child, including things such as gender dysphoria and the things that these kids are dealing
Well,
with.
that's exactly right. And Michael, aren't there already policies in place? I mean, even all the way back in the Stone Age when I was in elementary school, it was well established and understood that public schools had a role to play if they had evidence to believe a child was being abused at home. That's not new. I mean, you would know whether you had an abused child, I think, for the most part. Most people know how to spot that sort of thing. But to assume now that any child confused about their gender or wants to talk about gender issues may be bullied or abused by their parents, so we've got to keep it secret, that's a stretch.
It's flipping the script, that's for sure. I mean, as a child, I wish that my schools could have kept things secret from my parents, but that
Right.
didn't work out for me. But this says a lot. This particular case says a lot about the relationship between schools, public schools in particular, and parents, and how little some school board members, some teachers, some administrators think of parents. And what about the trust that's necessary between adults that are caring for a child at school or at home? There needs to be some trust there involved. And, you have to wonder, what else is a district like that keeping from parents? Are we keeping information secret about grades, about fights, about crime, about food poisoning in the school cafeteria? I mean, what kind of trust can you have as a parent in that situation?
Riley Gaines has made more news. She continues to be one of the loudest, kind of the public spokesperson for this transgender issue in sports. And the most recent story that you all have chronicled at the Lion, Josh, is, to her point, I think the most difficult of all the sports to imagine. And that is a biological male, transitioning into a female role and then boxing as a female. A biological man pretending to be a woman and boxing with other women. It doesn't get kind of more blunt force than that when you're talking about a biological man hitting a woman.
That's right. It seems like fighting sports and maybe basketball. I'm still waiting for the 7-foot biological male who transitions maybe to cause society a little bit more of an issue or a pause on this. But I think fighting sports would be one that seems pretty obvious.
Yeah.
But USA Boxing has just released its 2024 rule book, including allowing biological males to compete against or in the women's category. And basically they stipulate some testosterone maximum levels and things like that. But as Riley Gaines and other women's sports advocates have pointed out, that doesn't reverse puberty. It does not take away all of the biological advantages. I mean, it really does a small amount in terms of fairness. And So she said on this particular story, allowing men to punch women in the name of compassion and inclusivity is incomprehensibly despicable. And I thought, well, that's well said by a former All-American NCAA athlete.
Yeah, we're through the looking glass on this, Michael. I mean, she's right. Men hitting women. I like it. Were sanctioned, celebrated.
I believe you were told not to.
That's right.
Taught not to. And I think the most persuasive item that I saw in this story was the woman who said that women are not just a hormonal level, and that's true. In the North American Grappling Association grappled with this earlier last year and said after some females boycotted basically matches against biological males, they changed the rules to make sure they had a female-only division. That may be something they want to look at. And then, of course, last fall we had a situation in Massachusetts where a field hockey player, a girl, was hit in the face so hard by a male competitor, not a transgender, but a male competitor, that she lost some teeth and had some facial injuries.
We've seen, I think there was some footage recently of a volleyball player, maybe you mentioned this just a minute ago, a male who had transitioned to become a female on a female volleyball court in a competition, spiked a ball so hard it knocked another girl unconscious.
Yeah, that girl, we have reported on that story, and that young lady had severe injuries, and I think in a lawsuit disclosed some of those injuries, which included kind of some long-term concussion sorts of things that she's still dealing with. And, as these examples mount, and there's no doubt they will continue to mount, it just... the more that we have biological males competing against women, the more we're going to see these kinds of injuries. I think we'll be forced to really answer the question and not kick the can down the road. And I think it's an issue which we've discussed before, where we see liberal colleagues and friends who actually are also against it.
Yes. Yes, and I what we don't see a lot of, and you and I, we were all discussing this before the show, was you do not see a lot of, now there are women who have transitioned to become men or wish to become men, and this is not an equivalent storyline on that end. You don't see biological women transitioning to become men and joining men's football teams. You're not seeing that yet, anyway. I mean, I'm sure it's out there, but you don't hear it, quite like we're hearing these stories.
And I think female sports activists are starting to see what power they do have.
Yes.
And it's been proven that, if they don't participate in this, it's not going to happen.
The other issue that we cover a lot, I know you all write a lot about at the Lion, is the subject of social emotional learning and the money being spent in public school on DEI and SEL and all these other three-letter acronyms now for all of these projects. The money is still flowing. I mean, even though a lot of attention has been paid to it, money is still flowing, and you've covered that in a Pittsburgh area school.
That's right. So this is a Pennsylvania school district that because Parents Defending Education asked basically for invoices, they found that the school had spent at least $1.5 million with a few companies that are what some critics call woke or progressive or liberal in their policies and what they believe in, including diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives these companies hire based on DEI principles. And I think what stands out to me about these stories as we continue to cover them, and we've covered a lot about what took place at Harvard with the ousting of Claudine Gay, and I think DEI is becoming discredited. Now, it's been hammered and criticized now for, I don't know, about a year and a half or two everywhere. But I think finally you're getting a wide spectrum of folks from different political perspectives criticizing it, from Elon Musk to you name it. And so I think as parents begin to discover, or school boards or teachers or students, the connections that some of the curricula publishers have to these discredited issues, that more alarm bells need to be ringing.
Yeah, Claudine Gay has become sort of the poster child for this DEI movement, Michael. longest, or the shortest rather, shortest tenured stay for a Harvard president yet. I don't know how many countless numbers of plagiarism accusations. Clearly, her credentials weren't there. She was a DEI hire, a diversity, equity, inclusion hire, and it's the most prestigious university in the world, being ostensibly run by someone who couldn't be less qualified for the job. That's what DEI has wrought.
Yeah, and I think it's important. I'm sure that a lot of heads are swimming with this alphabet soup of DEI and SEL and so forth. I think it's important to understand what SEL is, what it purports to be, and what it actually is. So I went to a company's website that promotes this to find out what they say it is. And it says social and emotional learning is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. Well, it sounds innocent enough, though it sounds an awful lot like parenting, which I thought was my job. But it's more than that. And if you go on to read that very website, it says SEL advances educational equity, which has nothing to do with my social and emotional health, and that SEL can help address various forms of inequity and empower young people and adults to co-create thriving schools and contribute to safe, healthy, and just communities. Now, who decides what is just? Is that the curriculum? Is that various teachers? Is that the biggest kids? I mean, who is that?
And it just sounds so far removed from what I always thought school was about to begin with. Really? I mean, I know maybe that's an overly simple way to look at it, but where in that whole thing that Michael just read, Josh, do you hear algebra or United States history or science?
Yeah, and I think it's such an important point you make because these terms sound good, and in some of their definitions, they are good. Who doesn't want equitable schools?
Right.
And equality. You read some of our founding documents and you say, yes, this is what we want. And yet, what equity actually means is somebody determines what the outcome should be, and then they rearrange the game or the chess pieces or whatever, the board, to make it so. And the question is, well, who gets to decide what that outcome should be or what the board should look like?
Kamala Harris actually recently said, I think, that it's people ending up in the same place. I mean, are we going to apply that to sports? I'm not sure. But I think the bottom line here is that parents need to understand and know what SEL is, and taxpayers need to know because of all the money they're spending on.
Yeah.
And we know that school boards are always getting creative about new ways to name it. So once it becomes widely consumed and understood, then they name it something new. So you've got to be constantly mindful. Turning to a story that you have at the Lion in Minnesota, yet another instance, and I think you can find this just about anywhere you look. The amount of money spent on public schools never seems to directly correlate with outcomes. It's always this insinuation that our schools are poorly performing because we don't have enough money, yet I've never seen an instance where less money is spent year over year almost anywhere, Josh.
Yeah. This story is specifically about Minnesota, but it could be applied to just about all 50 states in the United States. And here's what the study found. Poor performance has not been caused by inflation or COVID-19 because the drop in performance began 5 years before COVID, and spending has outpaced inflation. And this is true in almost every state, and it's definitely true in Missouri, where we're currently sitting. You look at what states spend on education, and it has gone up, outpacing inflation over the last 20 years, and yet you're seeing performance decline, which suggests maybe we can't just throw money at the schools and expect better outcomes.
Yeah, I think we're dealing with non-pandemic learning loss here. And obviously the pandemic hurt very much, but it happened, as you say, before. Only in this particular case, in this Minnesota case, only half of K through 12 students were proficient in math before the pandemic. And that fell obviously during the pandemic, and the school closures didn't help, especially for Black, American, Indian, and Hispanic students. And in terms of approaching that achievement gap, they estimated with even the inflated spending that they've seen in Minnesota, it would take 250 years and $2 billion to close that gap.
Does it seem, and I know this is not necessarily a new thought, but it seems as though the COVID era, the pandemic era, froze the education system in amber for half a second and caused all of us collectively to kind of stare at it for the first time in a long while. It just kind of churned along without a lot of analysis, and then there was hyper-focus on it. Whatever that can mean, from DEI to SEL to transgender issues to money spent. Have you noticed that, or is that just my perception?
No, I think you're right, and I think some of it might be generational. It's the fact that, the three of us attended public schools, graduated from public schools, and then you become a parent, and you have an expectation that school's going to kind of do the same thing that it did for you, and now most of the time, if it's a two-parent household, both are working. If it's one-parent household, probably one of them's that parent's working. And so you need school to do its thing. You're going to send your kids there. You're probably not thinking a whole lot about it until everything in your life comes to a screeching halt. And then you got a lot of time to think about it, plus all the frustrations that I think schools caused parents during the pandemic. Not to mention the problem of, well, what do I do with my kid or kids now that we're all stuck at home together? So I think some of that did exactly what you described.
Yeah, and if I've got to be forced into an uncomfortable place to figure out how to educate my child at home, then I've got to be invested, which means I've got to pay attention, which means what's going on? I didn't even know this was going on, Michael.
Well before the pandemic, I got into this phase where I wanted to see what was in my son's textbooks. And so I grabbed the American history textbook, and I got to tell you, I didn't recognize this country in that book.
Wow.
And I think that was the experience for many, many parents during the COVID lockdown.
Who just hadn't stopped like you had prior, you
right.
mean? Mm-hmm.
And who saw in video classrooms what was going on. It was interesting what one person said about this situation in Minnesota, is that when businesses operate with the same level of financial mismanagement, they generally file for bankruptcy or face fraud charges.
Wow. Well, before we wrap up this week, we always like to take a brief pause, and I like to ask the gentlemen their favorite story, one in particular that stands out to them that they'd like to call your attention to at readline.com. So, Michael, we'll start with you. What do you like this week?
Well, I think it was that story about the snowboarding coach who just innocently joined in on a conversation with students about the advantage that biological males have over females. I think it's a tremendously important case. I think it's a sad situation and really tragic when you think about the guy couldn't just get his job back temporarily.
And Josh, you?
Well, there's a kind of story we often publish. Has to do with faith in the public square, athletes or other prominent personalities who are expressive about their Christian faith. And so this week we published one about Blake Corum, the running back for Michigan, who's an outspoken Christian. And it's always fun to highlight these things around major events that a lot of people are interested in watching. So that was my favorite.
Michigan's the Harbaugh family, right? Mm-hmm. Up there, that's the Harbaughs in particular. When you talk about faith, that's a big component of their program there. Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. And these stories and so many more are exactly what you'll find at readlion.com. That'll do it for us this week, but I do hope you'll keep up to date on all the latest news each and every day at readlion.com. For all of us at The Lion, thanks for downloading the show. See you next time.